Hi everyone, welcome to the Neo4j stream. My name is Will, and today we are continuing with our GRANDstack podcast application. So this is a podcast application built using GraphQL, React, Apollo, and Neo4j database. Let me drop a link to the GitHub project. Cool. So there's a link to the code in the chat. If you've been following along, this is now the sixth episode. We've built out our backend API, the GraphQL piece, using the Neo4j GraphQL library. We're using the podcast index for podcast search. So we're sort of wrapping the podcast index API with our GraphQL API. And then in the last couple of sessions, we focused more on the front end of the application. So we're using next.js, which is a React framework, and we've been working to add things like authentication and sign-in on the front end. And in the last session, we focused on using the Chakra UI component library to add some front features. So last time we got done with the episode view. So the episode feed for a user. So when I sign in, I see here's all the episodes that I've subscribed to, episode of the podcast that I've subscribed to, and then I can assign those to a playlist. But that's as far as we got last time. So what we're going to focus on today is the playlist view. So being able to select a playlist, create a new playlist, view all of the podcasts in that playlist, and then also front end for the podcast search functionality so that I can search for and subscribe to new podcasts. So that's what we're going to cover today. So we'll be using Chakra UI again. We'll do some Apollo client, querying our GraphQL API. We'll have to think a bit about, I don't know, maybe some optimistic UI features in Apollo client. That'll be a good one to touch on. And so the goal for today is to add the playlist sort of management functionality, I guess you could call it, being able to view all of our playlists, view all of the episodes in each playlist, and create new playlists. And then the podcast search result view. So that's the goal for today. Hopefully we can get through that. Feel free to ask any questions that you have in the chat, and I will try to post useful resources there as well. Before we get started, I want to talk about just a couple of interesting things going on in the Neo4j and graph database world. So one of those things is the Nodes conference. Nodes is the Neo4j Online Developer Expo and Summit. This is kind of like the annual online Neo4j developer-focused conference. The conference itself is in June, but one of the deadlines coming up fairly soon is if you're interested in submitting a talk. So Nodes, we love to hear what folks in the Neo4j community are working on. So we would love for you to share your graph story with everyone at Nodes. It's a really good opportunity to present a project that you're working on, something interesting that you've learned, some new use case that you've found for graph databases in Neo4j. So I'll drop a link in the chat to the Nodes 2021 site. And then also I'll drop a link for the call for proposals. So this closes on April 5th. So that's a few weeks. So if you're interested in submitting a talk, please submit it by April 5th. And if you're curious, sort of working on your proposal, have some ideas what would make a good proposal, check out some of the drop-in sessions on the Neo4j Discord. There is also a new podcast that Lou and I are co-hosting called GraphStuff FM. And this launched just this week. So we've launched just the first episode. I'll drop a link to that in the chat here, graphstuff.fm. So the goal for this podcast is to really focus on some of the more technical aspects of Neo4j. So looking at Neo4j from the developer's perspective in the podcast. So we'll cover things like, what is the Neo4j graph platform? How do I build applications with Neo4j? How do I use graph data science? These sorts of things. So we've recorded a few episodes. The first one was released yesterday or earlier this week, and it is focused on how to sort of think about building your proposal and talk for a technical conference. So this fits very well with the CFP deadline for nodes coming up. So check out that podcast. Let us know what you think. We will be doing episodes probably once a week, I think, for the foreseeable future here. Like I said, we have the first few recorded already, so that should be interesting. But definitely let us know what sort of topics you'd like to hear on the Graph Stuff Neo4j podcast. Cool. So with that, let's fire up our application and see where we left off last time. So I have Neo4j desktop running with my database from last time. So we have some users. Actually, let's take a look at the data model really quick. 7474. Yes. So here's the data model. We have podcasts that are connected to episodes. Episodes can be in a playlist, and a user subscribes to a podcast and owns a playlist. So the data model is fairly simple so far. If we look at some of the podcasts we have here, we can see podcasts have episodes. Here's a user that subscribes to this podcast. This user owns some playlists, and we can see some episodes that have been assigned to various playlists. That's the graph data model. Let's do our API and start our GraphQL API. This is running on 4001. Cool. So we can see the schema for our GraphQL API. We have a few different entry points. One is podcast search, which we're going to make use of that today. So that returns a podcast search result. And this, remember this podcast search result data, this is coming from the podcast index REST API. So this is not returning podcasts that we have in the database. We only parse a podcast feed and add it to the database when a user subscribes to it. We have playlists. That's another entry point that we will be using. So every playlist has a name and then an array of episodes that have been assigned to that playlist. And these are authenticated. Well, some of these, I guess, are authenticated query fields. So playlist, for example, this requires an authorization token. So if we go through the login or sign up mutation, that returns an auth token, which is a JWT, a JSON Web Token, that needs to be added as a bearer token in the request header. So that's how we make an authenticated GraphQL request. We add the authorization token here in the request header. So this query, we're going to search for all of the playlists that this authenticated user, and this is left over from last time. I think this is our JennyCat user, maybe. But here's the playlist that we have. So we have one called Breakfast Time. It has a couple of episodes. We have another playlist called Must Listen that has a bunch of other episodes. Okay, cool. So that's the GraphQL API. Now let's go to our next app and start that. And we'll see what the front end looks like. That's running on localhost 3000. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is sign in. I'll sign in as JennyCat. Cool, and this is what we built last time. Zoom out a little bit, try to make that readable. So this is what we built last time. So these are the episodes, the most recent episodes of the podcast that this user subscribes to. And then I can see which playlists these have been assigned to. I can assign them to other playlists. I can look at the show notes and I can play them, which I can hear that, but I guess that's just in my headphones. Okay, cool. So that's where we left off last time. So we have the episode feed, but what we want are now the playlists, I guess, is probably the next thing that we want to add. So when I click on playlists here, I think this will give me a 404. Yeah, we haven't built this page yet. So when I click on playlists, what I want is, because playlists this is an authenticated part of our GraphQL API. So in order to successfully query the playlist query field, you need to be signed in. You need to have attached that JSON Web Token to the header of the GraphQL request. So if we're not signed in, we need to just show the sign in form. And then if we are signed in, I guess we need to fetch all of the playlists for that user and all of the episodes for each playlist. That's not going to be a ton of data. We can probably just do that once when the page loads. And then we need to give a drop down for the user to select the playlist they want to view the episodes for, show them the episodes, kind of like that episode feed here, where we were showing just here's all the episodes for the podcast the user subscribes to. Basically, that sort of view. And then we also need to allow them to create a new playlist. So let's get started with that. I'm going to go into the next app directory in Pages. And one feature that's really nice in Next is the file-based router. So when I add a new file in the Pages directory, that maps to a route by the file name. So podcasts.js has a React component that is served when I go to /podcasts. So when I create playlists, this will export a React component that will be at /playlists. So export default playlists. And let's see, we probably need to import a few things. Well, we said that if the user is not signed in, then we want to give them the sign in form. So let's import that component. Sign in from components, sign in. We're also, we know we're going to need the episode component since we're showing like a list of episodes. And we will need our use auth hooks that we built a few sessions ago. So this has the functions for sign in, sign out that the sign in form uses. We've already built that in the sign in component. But what we want to use auth for here is to detect if the user is currently signed in or not. So that's how we know to display the sign in form. And what else? We know we're going to use some GraphQL queries. So let's import GQL use query. So we're going to run a query when this page first loads to find all of the playlists for the user. But then we're also going to need to execute a mutation if the user wants to create a new playlist. So we'll pull that in from Apollo client. And I think that should be good for now. So let's say to start off, we will actually let's start importing some things from Chakra. And remember, we introduced Chakra UI last time. So Chakra is a React component library that has some great styling features built into it. We are going to need a form. I like to start with the form control component, even if and this is mainly for like showing form context and validation, like if there's errors and whatnot. So we have that functionality built in there, but it's also a nice sort of grouping for a form in Chakra that I like to use. So let's start pulling in some of these things. So the container is maybe a place to start here. That just sort of applies some of the base styling of our default theme for Chakra. And we know form control and a select and a button, probably some of the basic things we'll need. We'll probably have to add some more imports there later. That's fine. Chakra UI React. Okay, so we want to wrap all this in a container so that some nice styles are applied. And then if we're not signed in, so let's grab the is signed in function from useauth. So if we're not signed in, then we're going to render the sign in. Let's get our multi-line back here. Just the save on formatting is sometimes smarter than we need it to be. That's fine. Okay, so that, and then if we are signed in, this is signed in. There we go. I turned off all of the IntelliSense and autocomplete things in VS Code since I think it's easier to not have all of those pop-ups on the live stream. But I guess maybe that leads to a few more tendencies to make errors, but we'll figure it out. So if we are signed in, let's wrap this in a div. This is going to be initially our form. Give it an ID, playlists. So here's our form, and then the form is going to have so we want like a select drop down over here, and then to the right of that, we want to have a button. So I like to use the flex component for that. That applies Flexbox CSS. So then our select needs a placeholder value, select playlist. And then when I select a new playlist in the dropdown, I need to handle that change. So the onChange handler gets passed in the change event. And let's set the selected playlist. So this is going to be a state variable that we're going to create in a second. So this selected playlist state variable does not exist yet. e.target.value. So when I select something from the dropdown, we'll update the selected playlist state variable. And then initially, let's just put in a placeholder for the options since we don't know. We're going to have to run a GraphQL query to find what the options are for the dropdown. So we don't know what those values are yet. So let's bring in use state from React. So use state, this will allow us to create state variables. And we want to create selected playlist. So selected playlist, that's the name of the state variable. And then we also get set selected playlist, we'll call it, in this tuple that is returned from use state. And we need to set the initial value for the state. So use state says, hey, we want to create a new state variable. This is the initial value, an empty string, and we get back this tuple that has the state variable and then a function to update that state variable, which is what we're calling in the change handler for our select dropdown. Okay, let's see what that looks like. So if we go to playlists, it says, hey, you're not signed in. So we need to sign in. We sign in and get an error that flex is not defined. So we'll pull that in. Is there anything else using form control? Flex. I think we got everything else. Cool. So now here's our drop down. We can select our placeholder value, foobar. That's fine. Nothing happens. Okay, cool. The next thing we said after this select is that we want a button over here. So we want a button that we can click to create a new playlist. So let's add a button. Let's use an icon. add icon, I think. So Chakra includes icon button. Where are the icons? Here we go. Chakra includes a bunch of icons that we can import. So the add icon, just a big plus. Import add icon from Chakra UI icon. So this comes in a different package. And let's give that some margin. So ML, it's a style prop that is short for margin left. So we're gonna add some margin to the left of the button so that looks a little nicer. Okay, nothing happens when we click the button. That's fine, we'll figure that out. So I think now what we want to do is, instead of having our sort of dummy default data for the options in the dropdown, let's actually run a GraphQL query and see the playlists for the authenticated user and populate the dropdown. So up here, we're going to define the GraphQL query for that. Let's call this get playlists. And this is going to be, jump over to Playground, something like this. So we're just going to grab all of the episodes for every playlist when the page loads. I don't think it makes sense to only fetch the data when a user selects the playlist. I don't think we're going to have that much data that it's too much to bring back. But we do need to bring back the fields for each episode that we need to then pass to the episode component that we built last time to render the episode component. So we need the ID, the title, audio, that's the audio file, summary is the description, you need the image, pub date, and we'll format that to grab the individual day, month, year, so that it was published. And then we need to know what podcast this episode belongs to, and that podcast has a title and an image. So I guess we don't need the image here. Well, I guess an episode can have a different image. So anyway, we'll grab it. Okay, so that looks like what we want. Let's copy this, and that's going to be our get playlist query. And we want to run this when the page loads. So data, come back from use query get playlists. That use query hook will also return if there's a loading state, if there's an error, but I think we'll just grab the data and just check to see if there is a playlist in the data to iterate through. I think that's probably fine. So instead of having this fake option value, we're going to, if we have data and if we have playlists, let's map over the playlists. And for each playlist, return an option where the key, and remember the key is needed by React so it knows which, anytime you iterate or map over a list like this where each element in your array that you're mapping over returns a component, you need to assign a unique key to each of those so React knows how to handle those in the virtual DOM. So the only sort of thing we have unique for a playlist is just the name. And that's also going to be the value for the drop-down option. p.name. Okay, let's see if that works. So we should see the playlists for this user. Cool, and I do, great. So here's the playlists that exist for this user who signed in. Great. The next thing we want to do then is when we select a playlist, we're updating this selected playlist state variable. So I think what we need is like a filtered playlist variable, where we're basically just filtering based on what playlist we've selected, and then the episodes in that playlist are what to render in the list. So let's create a filtered playlist. And this is going to be, if we have data, if we have playlists, filter that array. And what are we going to filter? Where the name of the playlist equals the selected playlist state variable. And then this gives us an array, because we're filtering the array for elements that match this condition. So we just want to select the first one, the first element in the array. Okay, so filtered playlist is now down here, where we want to then, I guess after the form, right after the form, we'll use a stack. Stack. We use a stack component from Chakra, which is really good for rendering lists of things. And specifically, we'll use the V stack for stacking things vertically. So this will be a V stack, and then we're going to map over our filtered playlist. So if we have episodes in that filtered playlist, we will map over the episodes and render a episode component. Remember, we need to give it a key. We have the ID of the episode in this case, which is the unique value. And then pass in the episode value as props. And then if you remember, the episode component also takes a playlist, and that's so that it knows when you click the, well, we'll see it in a second here. When you click, let's take a look. Here we go. When we click the plus button, it needs to know the playlist's data for this user so that it knows, okay, is this episode in this playlist? It has the logic in the episode component to figure that out. If it is, then it displays this check mark next to it, and then all of the episodes for the user, so you can assign that episode to a playlist. So that goes in the playlists prop, which we have in data.playlists. Cool. Let's see if this works. So if I go to playlists and select breakfast time, I get breakfast time, great. Jogging, great. So I'm getting the episodes that I have assigned to those playlists. Let's add maybe some margin or spacing, I guess, is what we want here on our VStack. And yeah, maybe some margin at the top. There we go. That looks better. Okay, so we have our playlists. We can view the episodes assigned to each playlist. The next thing we need to do is when I click this button, I need to create a new playlist for the user. And then I need to show it in the dropdown as soon as the user creates it. So for the UI component for that, I want to use a popover, which I think is down here in the overlay. Yeah, so we want a popover. And a popover, so there's a button, I click it, and we get the popover that shows up. And we can put form data, we can put any elements we want inside the popover. So I don't think we need something that looks that fancy, but just something like this. So we'll show a form when I click that plus button and just ask the user for the name of the playlist that they want to create. And then we'll put a button in there that says create or something like that. And when they click it, we then need to run a GraphQL mutation to create the playlist. So let's start there and define the GraphQL mutation that we need to run. So if we look in GraphQL Playground, and if we look at create playlist, there's a create playlist mutation, takes a name argument, and that's it. So up here, and typically you would define your GraphQL queries in one central file, maybe and reuse those. I like to include them in the component files like this, but whatever your preference is there, whatever makes the most sense, especially if you're going to be reusing GraphQL queries, it makes sense to include them in their own central file somewhere. But here we're going to define the mutation, and we need to declare some GraphQL variables. So let's call this create playlist. Wrap this in the GQL template tag. So this is a mutation, call it create new playlist. And here we declare the GraphQL variables that we're going to use. Say, call it playlist name, which will be a non-nullable string. And the mutation field is create playlist, argument name. That is our playlist name variable, and then we'll just return the name of the playlist that we created. And down here, for our mutation, create playlist, that is the function that we will call to execute the create playlist mutation. And this tuple also includes the data and error and loading, but we don't really care about that, I think, in this case. We're just going to sort of fire and forget the mutation. Okay, so that's the GraphQL mutation. When you have the create playlist function. Now we need, so here's our button, our add icon button. Now we need, zoom in a little bit. Maybe that's too big, but we'll try that. Now we need our popover. So let's go over to Chakra. This is a good example. This one, it's maybe too complex. Let's use this one as kind of a base example. So we have a popover, and I'm going to keep the button here. That's going to be our popover trigger. So we'll put our closing tag below the button. So we have the popover, and then we have a popover trigger. And the popover trigger is our button we've already created. So that button is going to be visible, but the rest of our popover is going to be hidden until we toggle it. And that content is in the popover content component. So there's a popover arrow and a popover close button. And I'm just following this example over here in the Chakra docs. So the popover close button, and then a popover header. And in the header, we're going to say create new playlist. And then we have a popover body. And here's where we're going to put our form. Let's do a form control. ID is new playlist. And the form control, this is going to be fairly simple. We'll have a text input. And here we need, for this change handler, we'll need to define another state variable. Let's do that in a second here. So when I start typing in the form, the change handler gets called and passed that event. So we're going to say set new playlist. So we're going to create a new state variable called new playlist. Set new playlist is the function to update that state variable. And the value is value of the text box. Let's create that state variable. New, what did we call that? New playlist. And set new playlist. And set an empty string for the default there. Okay, so we have an input, and then I guess we also need a button then. So this is inside the pop-up, remember, so something like this. So this pop-up comes up and it says, create a new playlist. What's the name of your new playlist? Whatever, and then a button to actually create the playlist and run the GraphQL mutation. So we'll have a button that says just something like create, but on the click handler, we want to call the create playlist function. So this is create playlist right here. This is going to execute our create playlist mutation, which we defined here, that takes a GraphQL variable playlist name. So we want to be sure to pass the playlist name GraphQL variable. So variables takes an object. Playlist name is new playlist. So new playlist, that's the state variable that we are using to store the value from that input form field. Okay, let's see if this works. Oh yes, a lot of things that I forgot to import from Chakra. So what did we have? We had a popover. We had a popover trigger. We had popover content. We had popover arrow. We had popover header. We had popover close button. I don't think I'm forgetting anything, but let's find out. So we'll sign in. Popover body, we forgot. Probably something else too. Input, yes. What else? Let's do a scan here. Form, we have input button, form control. Okay, this still works. So now let's click this. So this should trigger our pop-up. Cool, create new playlist. Oh, let's add some margin in here. And here's on the button. Some margin at the top, MT. There we go. Let's call this foobar create. Okay, I don't see it in the list, but if I go to home, I can see that now I have foobar as an option. So if I go back to playlists, now I have it as an option. So what's going on there? Well, let's take a look at the Apollo docs. Let's bring those up. We want Apollo client React, and down here in fetching. Okay, so what was going on here? So we'll come back to the docs in a second here. So when I run this mutation, I'm creating a new playlist, but the data for rendering the playlists, well, that's already been fetched, and Apollo client will cache that data in the Apollo client cache so that it's not sort of constantly going back to the server to fetch that. And because that data has already been fetched, cached, and is used to render the view, when I create something, I need to tell Apollo client to update the cache and use that new updated data when I then go back and look at the values in our dropdown. So how do we do that? Well, in a lot of cases, so let's see, caching query results. Actually, we want to be in the mutation section. Updating the cache after mutation, yes. So in most cases, so like let's zoom in a bit in the docs here. So if a mutation updates a single existing entity, Apollo client will automatically update the value for that entity in the cache if you return the ID field of the modified entity, right? So if we're updating something that already exists, we just need to return the ID field, and Apollo client is smart enough to update the cache. But that's not the case here because we're creating a new entity. So what we need to do is then update the cache explicitly update the cache explicitly when we run the mutation. So in this example, when the cache is updated, or when the mutation fires, that is updating the cache, adding the new value, which is what we're going to do. So over here in our call to create playlist, we are going to pass in a function for update. So update is passed a cache proxy, I guess is a way to think of it. So like it's a proxy for the Apollo cache, which we can then read from and write to. So we're going to do both of those things. We're going to read from the Apollo client proxy cache to see, okay, what are all of the playlist values, and then we're going to add our new one to it. So first, let's grab some data. So that will be proxy.read query, where the query is our get playlist query that we defined above. So what's in the cache for the get playlist query already? And then we're going to write to it, write to the cache. Update the cache for the get playlists query. And the data that we want to update is specifically the playlists, which is an array. And so we're going to do an array spread. So we want to include all of the existing playlists, but then add a new playlist. And this is an object. Apollo always adds the type name, and this is used in the cache. So we want to be sure to include the type name of this, which it's a playlist. And it has a name, which is new playlist. So now let's try this again. So now, before we had to sort of refresh the page to see the playlist that we created. But now let's go to playlist. So we have foobar and foobar2. So let's create foobar3. Create that, and now that should show up in the dropdown. Yeah, cool. So I didn't have to reload the page. I have foobar3, and here, let's do foobar4. Make sure this really works. Yep, there it is. Cool. So we're updating the Apollo client cache when we run that mutation. So that will then update in the UI. This is this idea of optimistic UI, that we're updating our UI without really waiting for the results of that mutation to come back. So we're optimistically updating it, assuming that that is going to work. Cool, and let's test to make sure that for our new one, so if I go back here and let's assign this one, this all-in podcast to foobar4. If I go to playlists, foobar4, yep, I have it. Cool, so that works. Cool, so that is the playlist functionality. I think that's everything we want for the playlist. The next thing we want to do is add the view for podcast search. So currently, if I go to /podcasts, I have just a very simple list here of all the podcasts in the database. And remember, we only add podcasts to the database when a user subscribes to it. So what I want is something that's using the podcast search query field here so that a user can search for whatever podcasts they're interested in, view the search results, and then subscribe to a podcast. So we're going to, let's start by updating this podcasts page, since we already have that. And I don't think it makes sense to just show a list of the podcasts we have in the database, since that's not really relevant for the user. So we'll change this to be podcast search instead of just show all the podcasts. And I think we'll probably also need to create a podcast component or something like that. Okay, so let's do a few things. Let's first change the podcast query here and instead use a podcast search. And we need to define GraphQL variables here. So we'll say, we can make this a little bigger, a little more legible. So we'll say query podcast search, and we need a search term is of type, what, non-nullable string, I think. And then we're going to run the podcast search query field is our entry point. We have our search term as a variable, and then want to return iTunes ID, title, description, the feed URL, artwork, the image, and any categories that the podcast is in. I guess that's pretty much all the fields that we have looking here. So let's see if this works. Let's add query variable here to the example search term. Let's search for hiking. And yep, get back some hiking podcasts. Cool. Remember, this is using the podcast index, which is a REST API, podcastindex.org. So in one of the previous episodes, I think this is the first one we did? Yeah, this was in the first one, episode 1, we got the podcast search functionality working in our GraphQL API. So there's a REST API. Let's get the docs. A REST API to search for podcasts by search term. And in our GraphQL API, in here, source, if we take a look at the schema, this is actually all implemented in Cypher using APOC, which I think is kind of fun. So we construct the headers for the podcast index, grabbing the authorization key that we've defined in a secrets file. Then we use APOC load JSON params to make a call to the podcast index REST API, passing in our search term, and then we return the results from the podcast index. So I thought that was a fun use of the Cypher directive in the Neo4j GraphQL integration, combined with some of the cool functionality in Cypher exposed through APOC to call another API. So that made our server code a bit simpler, I think. Okay, anyway. Oops, playlists. We wanted podcasts. Anyway, so that's how that works behind the scenes. So let's grab this podcast search query. It says podcast query. Let's change this to podcast search query. And change that here as well. Okay, let's import some things here that we know we're going to need. Well, we have another form that we're using to take in the search term, so we're probably going to create a state variable for that. Let's bring that in. Because the user has to explicitly type something in and click a button, we're actually going to not use useQuery. So useQuery from Apollo client, that will execute a GraphQL query when the component loads, so when the page loads in this case, but we actually want to do it manually when the user clicks a button. And for that, we're going to use lazy query, which is similar to mutation. It gives us a function that we could call to then execute that query. We will need to figure out if the user is authenticated, because again, since we want to encourage users to sign up for our application, so we don't want to allow users to search for podcasts and subscribe to podcasts if they're not authenticated. So we'll need to bring in our use auth hook, our auth provider that we wrote a couple of episodes ago, and then we'll need the sign in component. If the user's not signed in, we'll just show them the form. And I think we know a few things we're going to want from Chakra UI. Things like the form control, form label input, button. What are the other things we use? Container. We like to use flex. And we're going to be showing a list of things here. So let's bring in our VStack. Okay, so currently this is what we're doing is, well, use query. That's right. We want to switch that to use lazy query. And now this is going to give us a tuple. So get podcasts and data. We also have the loading and error state in here as well, but I'll just skip that for now. The is signed in function from our useAuth hook. And then let's go ahead and create a state variable for our search string. So we'll get the variable and the function to update it, set search string. Okay. So now let's put this in a container instead of a div so that our nice theme styles are applied. We don't need this h1, I don't think. So just like we did before, if they're not signed in, then we will render the sign in component. And if the user is signed in, then we will render, well, we need to add a form and then a list of podcasts. So if they are signed in, let's wrap this in a div. So this will be a form control. Let's call this podcast search. give it a label. Search for podcasts. Let's look at the form docs in Chakra for an example. Okay, so then I think we'll do a flex because again we're gonna, similar to what we did with the playlist, we're gonna have the input and then we want the button right next to it. So I like to use flex for flexbox, and we'll have an input. And when we start typing in this input, we need to set the search string. Set the search string state variable to the value in the form field. And we need a button. This will be our search button. And when we click the search button, that is when we run the mutation, get podcasts, and we need to pass in the variables object, which is going to be search term. So search term, that's the GraphQL variable we defined up here. And that is search string, which is the value in the form field. And then down here, so this was from our previous, where we were executing a GraphQL query using the podcast query field. This is podcast search, so the results will be a bit different. But I think that I think should work. So we have the form, the button when we click it, and then we just render an unordered list showing the title. Let's try that. So we need to sign in. Search for podcasts. Oh, let's put some margin left on our button. There we go. So if I search for hiking podcasts, there we go. Get back the title of a bunch of hiking podcasts. Okay, but we don't want to show just the title of the podcast. We want to show like the show art. We want to give the name of the podcast, the description of the podcast, and show the categories of the podcast. And then we want to have a button for the user to then subscribe to the podcast. So let's create a new component. So not in pages, but in components, since it won't be, everything in pages maps to the next.js file-based router. So we want just a component. Let's call this podcast. And so the podcast component, similar to our episode component, let's take a look at this. So our episode component, this is a flexbox with, lost our authenticated state there. Let's sign in again. So this is a flexbox with a rounded border. Then here, this is a box Chakra component with an image and then full width button below. And then on the right here, I think our podcast component will be a bit simpler. We'll just have like title, description, and then, we do have the categories. So for categories, Chakra has I think it's called a tag. Yeah, something like this, like a tag that we'll use to kind of inline the categories. So the episode component, I think, will end up being pretty similar to the podcast component. Okay, so the podcast, well, it takes a podcast object as props, and that is, we have it in here. Yeah, so title, iTunes ID, description, artwork, and categories. And then we said, just like our episode, it's the outer component is a flexbox, and then a box, which is kind of just like a div, but just kind of like a container. And let's just set, and so this is going to be the thing on the left here with the image and the button is one box. Let's set the width just fixed to 200 px. I think we can get away with that because all podcast art is square. And 200, I think, looks okay on any device. Okay, so that's the box, and then we want within that box the image so Chakra has a specific image component set. That's where the images comes from. We'll import that all in a second. The source for this is artwork, and set a size for this of 200 px. And then below that, we'll have a button, and this is going to be the subscribe button. So let's use another one of those add icons, like here. This looks good. And then the other part, so then the part on the right that's going to have the title and the description and the categories, that is also going to be a box. And let's set a max width on that. We don't need these to take up the whole screen. So we know our box on the left is going to be 200 px. Let's set a max width on this one to, I don't know, 300 should probably be enough. And we'll have a heading. That's going to be the title. And then text component, which has some nice typography styles for the description. And then we got artwork, we got title, description, categories. And we said we're going to use this tag component to show the categories, kind of like inline pills. So for that, we're going to use a stack. So a stack we said is good for showing like a list of things. Previously, we used VStack, which is like for stacking things vertically. But we can also, if we pass the isInline prop, we can do those horizontally all in line, which is quite nice. And so for this, we're going to iterate over the category. So categories is an array of strings. So we'll map over this and just return a tag. I guess we should give it a key. It's just the name of the category. Is that, I think, oh, we need to import a bunch of things here. We need to import what, button, flex, box, image, stack, text, tag, heading from Chakra UI. And we need our add icon. Add icon from Chakra UI icons. That's a different package. And now in podcast search, if we import our podcast component, now instead of an unordered list, we can change this to a vertical stack, a VStack. Let's spell that correctly, VStack. And then instead of a list item, we're going to return podcast component. So let's see if that works. Podcast does not contain a default export. Oh, did we not export? Podcast export default podcast. Okay, so here's the search. So we were searching for hiking. P is not defined in podcasts. Oh yeah, so when we were mapping, we used V. V for value, P for podcast. Let's use P for podcast. Had to refresh, so I need to sign in again. Search for hiking podcasts. Okay, so I see some issues. Let's see if we can clean this up. So a few things to think about. I guess first of all, we wanted that like rounded border, right? So I think if we set large for rounded, that gives us a large rounded border, and then border width we can set. And let's give this some margin. And let's see, our button. So one thing is our button here, we want that to be 100% width. So the same width as the image. And then I think, so what we see here is this looks okay, except in like some cases where we have some really long titles and some really long descriptions. Oh, and then if we have a lot of categories, we kind of overlap. So let's slice the categories, I guess. Let's just take the first 3 of those, so we won't overrun. I guess that's not going to be perfect if we have some long category names, but should be fine. And then for the heading, so we can specify, one thing I really like about the typography things in Chakra is we can specify number of lines, which will truncate. So for the title, let's do 2 lines. if we had, yeah, so here it truncates that if it's going to go more than 2 lines. And then let's do something similar for the description. Maybe 3 lines makes sense there. Yeah, and I am zoomed in a bit, so this looks larger than it actually is. Okay, so that's getting there. Let's add some margin on this box. There we go. And I don't know, we could add some margin to this box as well. I don't know, I kind of like having the image to the edge. I don't know, kind of whatever your preference is there. But okay, that looks okay, I think. I'm satisfied with that. And then we need, so this button, this is the subscribe button, which currently does not do anything. So let's make that do something. So we want, when we click that, we want to subscribe the user to this podcast. So if we go back to GraphQL Playground, in the docs, in our mutations, we have subscribe to podcast as a mutation field, and that takes iTunes ID. So our mutation is going to look something like this. Podcast subscribe, iTunes, is it iTunes ID, which is a non-nullable string. Subscribe to podcast, iTunes ID. I was not consistent on the capitalization there. That's fine. So both I and D are capitalized in my variable, but not in the argument. That's fine. So subscribe to podcast, and then turn title, iTunes ID. I don't think we really need those values. Okay, so now in our podcast component, let's call this podcast subscribe. Subscribe to podcast. And did we import? Oh no, we'll want to import GQL and use mutation from Apollo client. Ludwig says, thanks for the videos. Look at this one tomorrow. Yeah, cool. And I'll post the code as soon as we're done here up to the GitHub repo. And I have been writing blog posts as well for these, although I'm a little bit behind on that. But if you look in the README, here's the blog post that we wrote when we did authentication. We wrote the auth provider and started using next.js. So all these, I'll drop a link here to my personal blog. You can find all these write-ups on my personal blog. But yeah, the GitHub repo is the good place to go just to find the catch-up. Cool. So GQL and use mutation, we imported from Apollo client, and then what do we call this? Subscribe mutation, I guess, is what it will be. And I'll return some data. Use mutation for the podcast. Subscribe mutation. Cool. So now for our button, where's our button? This button. It gets an on-click handler that executes the subscribe mutation, making sure to pass in for the variables the iTunes ID, and that's the prop that's passed in up here. But remember our inconsistent casing, so I think it looks like that. So let's test this. So let's search for, I don't know, a news podcast. What sort of news podcast do we like? How about the Daily? I like that one. The New York Times Daily Podcast. There we go. So if we subscribe to that, that should fire off the mutation. And then that will also, if we look at our GraphQL API, that is when we parse the podcast feed. So if we look at our GraphQL schema, so we looked at the podcast search. Let's look at the mutations for subscribe to podcast. This is what we're calling. So this is also implemented all in Cypher. So what this one does, this is also, I think, a fun one. It makes a call to the podcast index, looking up the podcast by iTunes ID, and then finds the user, so the currently authenticated user, and then in Cypher there's this merge, which is kind of like a upsert get or create. So if the podcast doesn't exist in the database, it creates it, and then it uses the APOC load XML. So APOC is the like standard library for Cypher, so it includes procedures and functions that add functionality to Cypher. And we saw APOC load JSON up above, where we're making use of that to call the podcast index REST API. But now what we're doing here is we have the feed URL for the podcast. So podcasts are just an RSS feed, which is like an XML document that conforms to a certain specification. So we can parse the podcast feed using this APOC load XML to actually parse out from that RSS feed for each podcast the details, and then that then adds it to the database. So anyway, so if that worked, if we go to our episode feed, we should see some for the daily. Cool. So looks like we see a lot for the daily because there's a new one of those every day, and the other podcasts we have aren't updated as frequently. One thing we're also not doing that we need to add, and maybe we'll do this next time, is make sure that we are regularly updating and parsing our feeds to grab new podcasts, which currently we're only parsing the feed to add episodes when a user subscribes to it. So we need kind of a background job running there to be parsing episodes nonstop. I was kind of waiting until we had deployed our application somewhere so we had a database hosted somewhere in the cloud, and we can keep updating that in the background consistently. Probably doesn't make sense to have that running locally, but maybe that would be a good episode for next time. I don't know, let me know in the chat, or let me know on Twitter I'll drop a link to my Twitter user. This is me. So ping me on Twitter if you have ideas for what we should do in the next episode, because I think that now we have implemented what we wanted to for today. So we have our playlist functionality, so we can view playlists, create new playlists. We can add podcasts to playlists and then view that playlist. We have our podcast search functionality that we built. So we can search for podcasts to subscribe to. When we subscribe to them, then we tested that. It shows up in our podcast feed. We can add them to playlists. Now, if we go look at playlists, they show up. So I think we accomplished everything we wanted for today. So maybe we will call it good for today. And yeah, let me know what we should do for the next live stream. I think maybe deploying the database somewhere in the cloud, setting up to constantly update in the background, and then I guess also need to deploy the front end of our application as well. So maybe we'll do that next time, unless anyone has any other ideas for what to dig into next time. Friendly reminder, like we talked about at the beginning, if you're interested in submitting a talk for Nodes 2021, the call for papers is closing April 5th. So be sure, and that's the Neo4j online conference. So be sure to submit before that deadline if you're interested. And then also, Lou and I started a new podcast called Graph Stuff FM, which is all about Neo4j from a developer perspective. So if that sounds interesting, you can search that in your favorite podcast app. Just search for Neo4j or Graph Stuff, or go to graphstuff.fm to find those. And in the meantime, let me know what you think would be interesting to dig into for our next episode. We still have some features we need for our GrandCast podcast application. But thanks for watching today, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.